April 1951. The war in Korea shifts again. Chinese divisions move through the mountains at night, slipping past broken South Korean lines. Entire units dissolve into the dark, roads empty, hills change hands without warning. Near a narrow valley called Kapyong, 2 Commonwealth battalions move forward under new orders. They are not told to advance. They are not told to counterattack. They are told to take position and hold. The road below their hills leads towards Seoul. If it opens, the line bends again. What follows is not a sweeping maneuver or a dramatic charge. It is a fight for ground so tight that positions are counted by trench bays, not miles, fought mostly after sunset, where artillery flashes light the slopes and every second carries in the dark. It lasts one long night. When North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel in June 1950, the invasion moved fast. South Korean units fell back in confusion. Seoul changed hands quickly. Led by the United States, were fighting to prevent the entire peninsula from collapsing. The war shifted in September. The landing at Incheon cut behind North Korean lines and forced a rapid retreat. UN forces advanced north. By October, they were pushing toward the Yalu River at the Chinese border. It appeared the war might end as quickly as it had begun. It did not. In late October 1950, Chinese forces entered the war in large numbers. They moved mostly at night. They avoided roads when possible. They used the mountains for concealment and attacked in concentrated bursts against exposed positions. UN units that believed the war was winding down found themselves in a winter campaign fought in sub-zero temperatures against an enemy willing to absorb heavy losses to achieve surprise. Through the winter of 1950 and into early 1951, the front line moved back and forth across central Korea. Seoul fell again in January 1951. UN forces regrouped south of the Han River and began pushing north once more. By March, Seoul was back under UN control for the second time. The pattern was clear: advance, counterattack, withdraw, repeat. By April 1951, the war had settled into a tense battle. Neither side had achieved decisive victory. Chinese commanders prepared a major spring offensive designed to break that balance. The objective was not simply to take ground. It was to fracture the UN line, force a broad retreat, and once again threaten Seoul. The plan relied on mass and speed. Chinese units would attack South Korean formations first, seeking weak points. Once a gap opened, follow-on forces would push through quickly, widening the breach before reserves could seal it. Night movement reduced exposure to air power and artillery. Surprise would do the rest. In the sectors northeast of Seoul, South Korea's 6th Division occupied positions along approaches that ran through narrow valleys and steep ridgelines. Behind them, Commonwealth units, Australian and Canadian battalions within the British Commonwealth Brigade, were positioned as part of a larger UN defensive network. They were not the first line, they were depth. On April 22, 1951, Chinese forces struck. The pressure on South Korean units intensified rapidly. Positions that had appeared stable began to give way. Reports moved down the chain of command describing heavy attacks, infiltration through gaps, and units pulling back under strain. Roads that had carried supplies south began carrying retreating soldiers instead. One of those roads ran through the Kapyong Valley. It was not a large valley, and it was not widely known outside military maps. A river cut through its floor. Steep hills rose on either side. A single main road threaded north to south, linking forward positions to routes that led towards Seoul. If Chinese forces moved through that corridor in strength, they could turn adjacent UN positions and force a wider withdrawal. As South Korean elements fell back through the valley, higher command shifted Commonwealth units forward to occupy blocking positions. The order was direct and limited in scope. Take the high ground. Prevent further penetration. Hold long enough for the broader line to stabilize. By late April 23rd, Australian troops from the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, were moving into position on one of the dominant hills overlooking the valley. To their rear and flank, the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, prepared to occupy another key height. The road below them was filling with movement from the north. The Kapyong Valley was not wide, and it was not gentle. A river cut through its center, bending around gravel bars and shallow banks before narrowing again between steep slopes. The hills on either side rose sharply, covered in scrub, scattered trees, and exposed rock. Movement off the road was slow and exhausting. Movement on the road was exposed. That road mattered. It ran north to south, linking forward defensive positions with routes that fed directly towards Seoul. In a fluid battle, control of the high ground above that road meant control of the valley itself. Artillery observers could see along its length. Machine guns could rake its approaches. A force moving through without clearing the hills risked being cut apart from above. Two hills dominated this stretch of ground. To the west of the road stood Hill 504. Its slopes overlooked the valley floor and the approaches from the north. The feature was uneven, broken into spurs and folds that created dead ground between defensive positions. A unit holding it would need to spread out, covering multiple likely avenues of approach while maintaining communication across rough terrain. Farther south and east rose Hill 677. Taller and broader, it commanded both the valley and lateral movement along the ridgelines. From its crest, defenders could observe wide sections of the surrounding area. It was strong ground, but it required manpower to hold properly. Gaps between companies would be difficult to reinforce once fighting began. On April 23, 1951, 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, 3 RAR, moved on to Hill 504. The battalion had already seen heavy fighting in Korea. Its companies began digging in along the crest and forward slopes, positioning machine guns to cover likely approaches and establishing communication lines back to supporting units. Defensive fire plans were coordinated with artillery to the rear. Behind and slightly to the east, the 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, 2 PPCLI, prepared to occupy Hill 677. Their companies would form a defensive perimeter across the height, anchoring the southern edge of the blocking position. The Canadians were part of the 27th British Commonwealth Brigade, alongside the Australians and British units in support. Supporting them were additional elements positioned with purpose rather than prominence. The British 1st Battalion, Middlesex Regiment, brought heavy machine guns capable of sustained fire across fixed arcs. To the rear, the New Zealand 16th Field Regiment manned 25-pounder artillery pieces, already registered on key terrain features and road junctions. Their guns could reach both hills and the valley between. The placement of these units was not accidental. It created depth. If Chinese forces pushed through the valley floor, they would be exposed to fire from Hill 504. If they attempted to bypass that position and continue south, they would encounter Hill 677. The arrangement formed a staggered barrier, designed to slow and disrupt momentum rather than create an unbroken wall. By late afternoon of April 23rd, the valley carried signs of collapse from the north. South Korean troops withdrew along the road, some in organized groups, others in smaller clusters. Reports filtered back that Chinese formations were moving quickly behind them. The exact size of the attacking force was unclear, but it was understood to be substantial. As evening approached, Australian forward elements reported movement beyond their lines. Not armored columns or visible formations, but scattered figures, probing patrols, and signs of infiltration along the folds of the terrain. The hills that had seemed empty hours before were now alive with small movements in the gathering dark. The Canadians completed their defensive positions on Hill 677 as daylight faded. Communication lines were checked. Artillery coordinates were confirmed. Company sectors were defined against compass bearings and terrain features rather than visible landmarks. Below both hills, the road no longer belonged to one side. Contact would not begin with a single massed assault. It would begin in fragments, testing the edges of the line. The first full weight of the attack fell on Hill 504. As darkness settled on April 23, 1951, movement north of the Australian positions increased. At first, it came in small probes, scattered rifle fire, short bursts meant to draw a response and locate machine guns. Patrols moving along the lower slopes reported contact in multiple directions. The pattern was not random. It was deliberate pressure, applied along seams and folds in the ground. 3 RAR had established its companies across the crest and forward spurs of Hill 504, but the terrain forced dispersion. Sections were separated by broken ground and shallow valleys that limited direct visibility. Communication depended on field telephones and runners. Once firing intensified, both would be strained. Shortly after nightfall, Chinese forces began a coordinated assault. Bugles sounded from the darkness, not continuously, but in sharp calls that carried across the valley. Whistles followed, then small arms fire built in volume. Figures moved uphill in waves, some advancing directly, others slipping along gullies to approach from angles the Australians could not fully observe. The first assault struck forward platoons positioned on exposed spurs. Machine guns opened in controlled bursts, cutting lanes through advancing lines. Artillery from the New Zealand 16th Field Regiment began firing pre-registered defensive tasks onto likely assembly areas and approach routes. Shells landed beyond the Australian perimeter, then crept closer as needed. The attacks did not stop. Chinese units pressed forward despite losses, seeking to overwhelm isolated positions. In several sectors, fighting close to short range. Grenades were exchanged across shallow trenches. Rifle fire flashed at distances measured in yards. At times, attackers reached the wire and defensive pits before being driven back. As the night deepened, the shape of the battle changed. Instead of large frontal pushes, infiltration increased. Small groups of Chinese soldiers slipped through gaps between Australian positions, appearing unexpectedly behind forward elements. Some platoons found themselves receiving fire from more than one direction. Reports filtered back that enemy movement was occurring along the ridgeline itself. Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Ferguson, commanding 3 RAR, faced a narrowing set of options. The battalion's mission was to block the valley, but its forward companies were becoming isolated. Communication lines were cut in places. Ammunition expenditure rose steadily. Reinforcing one threatened position meant exposing another. Artillery support remained steady, but even effective fire could not fully seal the broken terrain. The Chinese attacks adapted quickly, using dead ground to assemble for renewed pushes. Each assault forced the Australians to expend more ammunition and reveal more of their defensive layout. By midnight, pressure was sustained across much of Hill 504. In one sector, a forward company lost direct contact with the battalion headquarters. Fighting continued in darkness, guided by flares and the sound of movement rather than clear lines of sight. Attempts to re-establish communication required movement across exposed ground under intermittent fire. Casualties mounted, though exact numbers were unclear in the confusion. Despite repeated attacks, the Australian line did not collapse. Positions were bent, not broken. Machine gun crews shifted arcs. Platoon leaders adjusted their sectors to close emerging gaps. Artillery fire continued to fall on slopes below the crest, breaking up massed attempts to advance. As the night wore on, it became evident that the battalion could not maintain every forward position indefinitely. Enemy forces were moving around exposed flanks and appearing in rear areas. The risk was no longer simply being pushed off the hill, but being encircled and cut off entirely. Before first light, Ferguson made the decision to conduct a fighting withdrawal. The order moved down through companies as quietly as possible. Sections disengaged in stages, covered by neighboring units. Artillery shifted fire to screen the movement. Vehicles and heavy weapons that could not be safely recovered were destroyed or abandoned. The withdrawal was not a rout. It was controlled and deliberate, carried out under pressure. Units pulled back towards secondary positions to the south, maintaining cohesion despite continued contact along parts of the slope. By dawn on April 24th, Hill 504 no longer held Australian troops. Chinese elements moved across ground that had been fiercely contested hours earlier. The hill itself bore the marks of sustained fighting: spent cartridges, shattered brush, and shallow defensive works torn open by mortar fire. Below, Chinese elements began using the valley floor with less hesitation. Those advancing elements now faced the next height in the line. Hill 677 rose higher and broader than Hill 504, its slope stretching wide before narrowing near the crest. From its top, defenders could observe much of the Kapyong Valley and the road running through it. It was strong ground, but it demanded discipline. The perimeter was long. The distances between companies were measured in hundreds of yards, not steps. On April 24, 1951, 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, 2 PPCLI, completed its defensive layout across the hill. A Company held part of the forward slope. B and C companies anchored adjoining sectors. D Company positioned to guard approaches from another angle. Battalion headquarters sat near the crest, where communication lines radiated outward along shallow trenches and exposed tracks. The Canadians understood that the Australians to their north had been forced to withdraw. That fact did not require explanation. The movement in the valley below made it clear. Chinese elements were now pressing south, using the road and the folds of the terrain to advance. Artillery coordination was confirmed again. The New Zealand 16th Field Regiment had already registered defensive fire tasks across likely avenues of approach. U.S. artillery units in support had plotted additional targets. The British Middlesex Regiment's machine guns were positioned to add sustained fire across fixed arcs. The hill was not isolated. It was part of a layered defense. By late afternoon, contact began. Chinese probes struck the lower slopes first. Rifle fire cracked upward from tree lines and scrub. Mortar rounds followed, walking slowly up the hill toward known and suspected positions. The pattern mirrored the previous night's tactics: test, adjust, then press harder. As evening fell, the attack intensified. The attacks came in organized surges from the lower slopes, timed and coordinated in the way the valley fighting had already begun to show. Chinese infantry advanced in groups, some moving directly uphill, others slipping along gullies and shallow depressions to approach from the sides. The slope that had seemed empty hours earlier now carried movement in multiple directions. A Company absorbed one of the first heavy assaults. Machine guns opened in disciplined bursts, sweeping sections of the hillside. Riflemen fired into advancing shapes, illuminated briefly by muzzle flashes and artillery bursts in the distance. The attackers closed quickly, using dead ground to mask their approach into the final yards. In several sectors, fighting closed to grenade range. Trenches and shallow pits became focal points, contested at distances too short for broad maneuver. Platoon leaders shifted men along the line to reinforce weak spots. Runners moved under fire to maintain contact where field telephones failed. Mortar fire increased. Shells burst along the crest and behind forward companies, seeking to disorient and pin defenders before the next infantry surge. The noise rolled continuously across the hill. Artillery detonations from friendly guns, incoming mortar rounds, and small arms fire layered together. The line held, but it held unevenly, with some sectors taking far more weight than others. Near midnight, pressure mounted on one forward company to the point where its position risked being overrun. Chinese troops had worked close to the trenches, some reaching wire obstacles and engaging at close range. Requests for artillery shifted from forward slopes to positions dangerously near Canadian lines. Fire missions were approved. Artillery shells landed along the lower edges of the defensive perimeter, then crept closer as necessary. The coordination required precision. Too far forward and attackers regrouped. Too close and defenders risked friendly casualties. Observers adjusted fire under combat conditions, balancing urgency with control. The effect was immediate and violent. Concentrated artillery broke up massed formations and forced attackers to ground. But the assaults resumed after each barrage, testing for weak points along the wide arc of the hill. Throughout the night, Chinese units attempted to exploit gaps between companies. In darkness, distances felt larger than they were. Small groups slipped through folds in the terrain, appearing unexpectedly along lateral tracks near the crest. Battalion headquarters reported contact closer than anticipated. Internal movement became as important as forward defense. Communication remained fragile but functional. Orders passed by runner when lines were cut. Company commanders adjusted sectors as reports came in. Ammunition was redistributed where possible. No single sector collapsed, though several were pressed hard enough to require immediate reinforcement. American tanks from the 72nd Tank Battalion, positioned off the hill along the valley floor, contributed fire where terrain allowed. Their main guns could not always elevate enough to strike higher slopes effectively, but machine guns and direct fire into visible assembly areas added weight to the defense. By the early hours of April 25th, the pattern of attack began to shift. The intensity of each assault lessened slightly. Gaps between waves lengthened. Artillery continued to fall on pre-registered targets beyond the perimeter, disrupting attempts to reorganize. The defenders remained in place, though fatigue and ammunition expenditure were evident across the line. When first light edged across the valley, the slope below Hill 677 showed the aftermath of sustained fighting. Movement to the north had slowed. The Canadian perimeter, though scarred and tested, remained intact. The guns behind them had not been silent during the night. They had fired steadily, shaping the ground beyond the crest and breaking up each attempt to gather strength below the hill. The battle for Kapyong was fought in trenches and along ridge lines, but it was shaped by guns positioned miles behind them. The New Zealand 16th Field Regiment had brought 25-pounder artillery pieces into the sector before the fighting began. Each gun crew operated with a routine built on precision. Targets were plotted in advance. Likely approach routes were registered. Defensive fire tasks were assigned grid references long before the first Chinese infantry moved into the valley. When contact began on Hill 504, those preparations were tested immediately. Fire missions were requested by forward observers embedded with the Australian and Canadian units. Coordinates moved through radio and telephone networks to gun positions in the rear. Orders were brief and direct. Target number, range, bearing, shell type. Within seconds, crews adjusted elevations and traverse, then fired in sequence. At Kapyong, artillery was not used sparingly. It was used continuously. As Chinese forces assembled below the hills, the New Zealand guns struck road junctions, gullies, and tree lines where movement was detected. When attackers closed to the lower slopes, fire was shifted closer to friendly positions. The margin for error narrowed, but so did the space available for massed assault. Over the course of the battle, thousands of rounds were fired in support of the defense. Exact figures vary in official records, but the volume was substantial enough to keep sustained pressure on advancing formations. The tempo of fire rarely dropped to silence during the critical hours. Coordination mattered as much as volume. Forward observers had to balance urgency with control. Calling fire too early allowed attackers to adjust and regroup. Calling it too late risked overrun positions. Communications were strained by combat conditions, yet the link between hilltop defenders and artillery batteries held. American artillery units in support added depth to the fire plan. When Canadian companies on Hill 677 faced heavy pressure, additional batteries were brought into the pattern. Fire missions overlapped in time sequences designed to prevent Chinese forces from reorganizing between barrages. There were moments when shells landed close enough to Canadian and Australian lines that debris showered defensive pits. Those decisions were deliberate. Artillery fire was brought in tight to break assaults that had reached wire obstacles and trench edges. It created a barrier of fragmentation that attackers had to cross under extreme risk. The Chinese relied on speed and mass to achieve local superiority. Artillery disrupted both. Columns moving along the valley floor were forced to scatter under bombardment. Assembly areas became untenable. Units attempting to regroup for coordinated pushes found themselves under renewed fire before they could regain momentum. Even when attacks resumed, they did so in smaller fragments. The guns also shaped daylight. Chinese forces that had advanced during the night faced exposure once the sun rose. Artillery observers could now see movement more clearly. Defensive fire shifted from reactive to anticipatory, striking ridgelines and tracks where renewed attacks might form. By the morning of April 25th, the pattern was clear. The hills had been defended by infantry, but the space between them had been controlled by artillery. Without sustained fire from the rear, the pressure on both 3 RAR and 2 PPCLI would have been heavier, more concentrated, and more difficult to break apart. When the rate of fire finally slowed, it marked more than a pause in shooting. It marked a change in momentum across the valley. The fighting at Kapyong was not an isolated clash. It was one piece of a larger Chinese spring offensive designed to fracture the United Nations line in April 1951. Chinese commanders had assembled multiple armies for the operation. Their method relied on concentrated blows against selected sectors, especially those held by South Korean units. Once a gap opened, follow-on forces would move rapidly through it, widening the breach and forcing adjacent formations to withdraw. The goal was not merely to seize ground, but to unbalance the entire front. Speed was central to that design. Chinese infantry moved primarily at night to avoid air power. They carried light equipment, allowing them to traverse rough terrain that vehicles could not easily navigate. Attacks were often preceded by infiltration, slipping between positions rather than striking only at the strongest point. When pressure achieved a breakthrough, exploitation followed quickly. In the Kapyong sector, the collapse of South Korea's 6th Division created the opening the offensive required. Roads filled with retreating troops. Defensive continuity broke down. For a brief period, the valley north of Hill 504 offered a corridor toward deeper positions. But a corridor is only useful if momentum is maintained. At Kapyong, that momentum slowed. The decision to occupy and hold the hills overlooking the valley forced Chinese forces to shift from rapid exploitation to deliberate assault. Instead of moving along roads and through gaps, they had to climb steep slopes under observation and fire. Each attack required time to organize and space to assemble, both of which were reduced by sustained artillery strikes. Chinese infantry were accustomed to absorbing losses to achieve tactical objectives. At Kapyong, they pressed forward repeatedly despite heavy fire. Yet the terrain imposed limits. Narrow approaches funneled movement. Dead ground offered concealment but also broke cohesion. Units that advanced through gullies and folds often emerged separated from supporting elements. Without heavy armored support or substantial artillery equal to that of the defenders, assaults depended on closing distance quickly. That proved difficult when pre-registered fire blanketed likely assembly areas. The offensive did not collapse everywhere at once. In other sectors along the front, Chinese units continued to apply pressure. Gains were made in places, but the rapid breakthrough envisioned in this portion of the line did not materialize. Time became a factor. Each hour that Hill 504 resisted, and each hour that Hill 677 held, allowed higher command to reposition reserves and reinforce adjacent sectors. The road through Kapyong remained contested rather than open. Movement through the valley required caution instead of speed. By the morning of April 25th, the immediate objective in this sector, driving quickly towards Seoul through the gap, had not been achieved. Chinese formations still occupied ground north of the hills, but the push had lost its initial rhythm. An offensive built on momentum cannot pause easily. Once slowed, it invites resistance elsewhere. The broader UN line stabilized in the days that followed, supported by repositioned units and renewed defensive planning. At Kapyong, the result was not a dramatic counterattack or a sweeping advance. It was a stoppage. The corridor that had appeared open on April 22nd no longer offered a clear path south. When the firing tapered off in the Kapyong Valley, the ground told its own account. For 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, the fighting on Hill 504 had come at a measurable cost. 32 Australians were killed during the battle, 59 were wounded. Several others were taken prisoner in the confusion of the night engagement and subsequent withdrawal. The battalion had absorbed sustained pressure from a numerically superior force and disengaged under fire without dissolving into disorder. For 2nd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, the losses were smaller in number, but no less significant. 10 Canadians were killed, 23 were wounded. Across the wide arc of Hill 677, companies had been pressed repeatedly, yet the perimeter remained intact at first light. Chinese casualty figures are more difficult to establish with precision. Contemporary estimates suggested several hundred killed or wounded in the assaults on both hills. Later assessments vary, and official Chinese records from the period are limited. What can be stated with confidence is that the attacking formations suffered substantial losses in repeated uphill assaults conducted under artillery fire. The numbers alone do not explain the effect. The battle at Kapyong did not end the Chinese strong offensive, but it disrupted its tempo in this sector. The corridor towards Seoul remained contested rather than open. Commonwealth units had prevented a rapid exploitation through the valley at a moment when the broader line was strained. Recognition followed. Both 3 RAR and 2 PPCLI were awarded the United States Presidential Unit Citation for their actions at Kapyong. The decoration is rarely given to non-American units. It recognized collective performance under sustained combat conditions rather than a single isolated act. The citation acknowledged disciplined defense, coordination under fire, and the ability to hold critical ground despite numerical disadvantage. For the soldiers involved, the battle did not end with the award. Units reorganized, casualties were evacuated, equipment was repaired or replaced, positions shifted again as the front stabilized. The Korean War did not return to rapid maneuver in the same way it had in 1950. Instead, it began hardening into a conflict defined by fortified hills, artillery duels, and negotiated lines that would move only slightly over the next 2 years. Kapyong became one of several engagements that marked that transition. Within Australian and Canadian regimental history, the name carried weight. It represented a defensive stand conducted under pressure and executed without collapse. The battle was not large by the scale of the World War II campaigns, nor did it dominate international headlines. Yet within the formations that fought there, it stood as proof of cohesion in a multinational force operating far from home. The hills themselves returned to silence after the fighting moved elsewhere. The road through the valley remained in use. The river continued its path between the slopes. What remained were the recorded losses and the position that had been held long enough to change the rhythm of the advance. The Korean War is often remembered through larger movements. Incheon, the Chosin Reservoir, the advance to the Yalu, the long armistice talks. Kapyong does not sit at the center of those narratives. It occupies a narrower place, defined by 2 hills and a single valley. Within Australia and Canada, that narrow place carries weight. For the Royal Australian Regiment, Kapyong became part of regimental identity. It was a test of a relatively young battalion operating under sustained pressure in a multinational force. The battle demonstrated discipline under night assault, controlled withdrawal under threat of encirclement, and coordination with artillery and allied units. It was not framed as a dramatic charge, but as a position held long enough to matter. For Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, Hill 677 marked one of the most recognized engagements in its history. The battalion's stand under repeated attack reinforced its reputation within the Canadian Army and beyond. The U.S. Presidential Unit Citation awarded for the battle remains a rare distinction for a Canadian unit, tied directly to the defense of that height. Kapyong also stands as an example of Commonwealth cooperation within a larger United Nations command structure. Australian, Canadian, British, New Zealand, and American units operated in layered support roles. Infantry held the crests, machine guns covered fixed arcs, artillery batteries in the rear shaped the space between hills. No single element carried the fight alone. By mid-1951, the character of the war had shifted. After the spring offensive, the front stabilized roughly along a line not far from the 38th parallel. Operations became increasingly defined by fortified positions and limited offensives aimed at improvising tactical advantage rather than achieving sweeping breakthroughs. Hills were named and contested. Artillery exchanges became routine. Negotiations began, even as fighting continued. In that environment, battles like Kapyong took on added significance. They demonstrated how local resistance could interrupt broader plans. They showed how terrain, preparation, and coordination could offset numerical disadvantage. They marked the point where mobility gave way to entrenchment. The valley itself remains much as it was in 1951. The slopes still rise sharply from the river. The road still runs north to south. The names assigned to those hills persist in military records and regimental histories. Kapyong did not end the war. It did not decide the armistice line. What it did was hold a corridor closed at a moment when it might have opened. For one night in April 1951, that was enough. The war in Korea did not end at Kapyong. It dragged on for 2 more years. Lines hardened, hills were named and renamed, negotiations stalled and resumed. But momentum matters in war. In April 1951, momentum was moving south. At Kapyong, it slowed. Not because of overwhelming numbers, not because of a sweeping counterattack, but because 2 battalions took ground they had not expected to defend and refused to let it go. No grand speeches marked the moment. No headlines carried it far beyond the peninsula. Just a valley, 2 hills, and a road that did not open. And sometimes in war, stopping movement is victory enough. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
Oh, Dave.